You'd think planting a few tomatoes in your own front yard would be harmless, right? Think again. Michael Carter, a retired attorney just looking to trade courtrooms for cucumbers, never expected a war to erupt over his garden. But that peaceful life came crashing down the moment Nancy Williams, HOA president, self-declared aesthetic dictator, and walking power suit, stormed into his yard with a clipboard in one hand and vengeance in the other. What followed was nothing short of chaos. 3 bulldozers, an emergency vote, a hidden land deed older than the HOA itself, and one brave old woman with a cane and a memory sharp enough to take down an empire. Throw in a secret whistleblower from within the HOA, a $300,000 fraud scandal, and an attempted act of garden vandalism caught on camera, and suddenly, tomatoes are the least of Michael's worries. This isn't just a story about vegetables. It's about justice, legacy, and a neighborhood refusing to be bullied one more inch. Buckle up, because this is real HOA drama. And if you love stories of corruption, comebacks, and court-worthy karma, hit that subscribe button and join the rebellion. The garden war has begun. Michael Carter had never thought retirement would be this good. After 15 grueling years of defending corrupt CEOs, fighting soul-crushing depositions, and drowning in legal briefs, he'd finally traded his suit and tie for sun hats and garden gloves. Now, instead of courtrooms and caffeine, he had rows of tomatoes and the warm kiss of the morning sun on his back. Life, for the first time in decades, had a peaceful rhythm, until Nancy Williams stomped into his paradise like a designer hurricane in heels. It was a quiet Tuesday morning. Birds chirped. Bees buzzed. Michael, kneeling in the soil in his front yard, was humming some half-remembered Sinatra tune while planting heirloom tomato seedlings, his pride and joy. The earth was soft, the air crisp, and his mind blissfully clear, until a sharp voice sliced through the tranquility like a legal cease and desist. "Excuse me," the voice snapped. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Michael looked up, squinting against the sun. There she was, Nancy Williams, the queen of control, HOA president, and self-appointed aesthetic dictator of Willow Creek Estates. Her arms were crossed tightly over her pristine, pastel blouse. Not a hair on her highlighted head dared move. Even the wind knew better than to mess with Nancy. "Well, good morning to you too," Michael said, rising to his feet and brushing the dirt from his knees. "Just expanding my vegetable patch a little. Tomatoes don't plant themselves, you know." Nancy's lips tightened into a line so thin it might have vanished. She scanned the garden beds with disdain, as if he'd laid landmines instead of lettuce. "This is unacceptable," she huffed. Per HOA guidelines, front yards must be landscaped with ornamental flora approved by the Architectural Standards Committee. Vegetables are to be confined to backyards. Out of sight. Michael resisted the urge to roll his eyes. Instead, he reached into his gardening apron and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "My deed predates the HOA by a good 30 years, he said calmly, offering her the document. "I've got full exemptions. Right there in black and white." Nancy didn't take the paper. Instead, she whipped out her phone like it was a weapon and began snapping photos of the garden, muttering something about immediate violations and emergency board meetings. "You'll be hearing from us soon," she declared, tapping her screen with righteous fury. "And I suggest you remove this mess before fines start piling up." Michael gave her a little smile, the kind that said, "I've cross-examined senators, lady. You're gonna need more than bylaws and a blowout to rattle me." As she stormed off, high heels clacking like an angry metronome on the sidewalk, Michael noticed something curious. Standing a few steps behind Nancy was a younger woman, late 20s maybe, wearing a conservative HOA staff badge and holding a clipboard. She hadn't said a word during the exchange, but as Michael caught her eye, she didn't look smug or annoyed like her boss. She looked conflicted. Their eyes met for just a second too long. Her lips parted like she might say something, but then she quickly turned away and followed Nancy, her heels clicking more softly, hesitantly. Rachel, her name tag read. Michael didn't know it yet, but that single glance from Rachel would be the first crack in Nancy's perfect porcelain world. Something about her look, uncertain, almost guilty, made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. There was more to this battle than begonias versus beefsteaks. He could feel it in his bones. And as the door slammed shut behind Nancy's Lexus SUV, Michael bent down again, gently patting the earth around his tomatoes. "Hang tight, boys," he whispered. "Looks like we just planted ourselves into a war." The rumble hit Michael's bones before it hit his ears. It was just past 7 a.m. He was pouring himself a cup of coffee, still in pajama pants and a faded Harvard Law t-shirt, when the sound rolled in, deep, mechanical, angry. The kind of sound that makes animals bolt and neighbors part their curtains. He moved to the window. His mug slipped from his hand and shattered on the hardwood floor. 3 bulldozers, parked diagonally across his driveway like some kind of armored HOA roadblock. Bright yellow, massive, engines growling low like beasts waiting to be unleashed. And there, standing triumphantly at the front like a general surveying the battlefield, was Nancy Williams, pristine as ever in a power pantsuit, arms crossed, chin high, eyes practically sparkling with malice. Beside her was a tall man in an expensive navy suit, flipping through a leather-bound binder like he was prepping for a hostile takeover. Michael didn't need to guess. That was Robert Taylor, the HOA's legal counsel, a man with the charm of a tax audit and the warmth of a lizard. Michael grabbed his phone and the file folder he kept labeled HOA Nonsense and stepped out onto the porch. His slippers slapped softly against the wood, but his voice was solid steel. "Nancy," he said, "I don't know what circus you think you're running here, but this isn't legal. And that," he pointed to the dozers, "is a lawsuit waiting to happen." Nancy smiled sweetly, venom behind her teeth. "The board held an emergency vote last night," she said, loud enough for the small crowd of onlooking neighbors to hear. "Your garden has been classified as a public nuisance. We are authorized under Section 8.3 of the HOA bylaws to begin immediate remediation." Robert stepped forward like a smug barracuda. "You were advised in writing. The fines are at $300 and rising. We're simply enforcing compliance." Michael raised an eyebrow. "With construction equipment?" "You forced our hand, Mr. Carter," Robert replied, by ignoring multiple notices. Michael took a slow breath. His mind went into litigator mode. He started forming arguments, citations, strategy. But before he could speak again, his phone buzzed. A text. From an unknown number. "Don't let them touch it. You have rights. I'll help. R." He glanced back at the HOA group. Behind Nancy and Robert, partially hidden behind a clipboard, stood Rachel, the quiet, brown-haired assistant from the day before. Her eyes flicked up, just briefly, and met his. She nodded, almost imperceptibly. Michael's pulse jumped. He didn't know how much she knew, but he knew enough now to stall. "You're about to bulldoze temporary garden beds," he said loudly, "on a property exempt from your authority. I've already contacted my attorney, and I'm calling the county clerk's office. Any damage you cause will be met with immediate legal action." Nancy rolled her eyes dramatically. "We've heard enough of your legal posturing." "Good," he said, flipping open his folder. "Then you'll love this next part." He began dialing. The dozer operators, sensing tension, looked increasingly uncomfortable. One of them actually shut off his engine. Nancy's eyes narrowed. She didn't like losing ground, but she had no idea, no one did, that help was already en route. That her bulldozers were parked on a ticking time bomb of old land deeds, mineral rights, and a very pissed-off lawyer who just wanted to grow tomatoes. Rachel glanced up again, biting her lip. She turned and walked back toward the HOA SUV, but not before Michael saw her slide her phone into her jacket and hit send. The war had begun. And this morning, it came with bulldozers. By the time the third bulldozer's engine sputtered back to life, Michael Carter had made 3 calls, sent 6 emails, and was already on his second pot of coffee, this one much stronger than the first. Nancy and her legal lapdog, Robert Taylor, were still camped on the curb like they were filming an episode of HOA Justice, Special Vegetation Unit. Robert was thumbing through his binder like it contained the U.S. Constitution, while Nancy paced in front of the bulldozers, barking orders and occasionally throwing glare sharp enough to slice through Kevlar. What she didn't expect, what none of them expected, was the arrival of a county sheriff's cruiser, a marked vehicle from the county clerk's office, and a dusty old Chevy Suburban carrying the local surveyor. The cavalry had arrived. Sheriff Luis Martinez, broad-shouldered and eternally unimpressed, stepped out of his cruiser like he'd just walked off a John Wayne set. He adjusted his belt, surveyed the situation, and approached Michael. "Morning, Mr. Carter," he said. "Got your call. What's all this?" Before Michael could answer, the passenger door of the county vehicle opened and Martha Gonzalez, county clerk, emerged, holding a massive cardboard box labeled Anderson Trust, 1973 to 1987. She was followed by Calvin Brinks, the local land surveyor, carrying rolled-up maps older than most of the neighborhood. Nancy's jaw clenched so hard Michael thought he heard a molar crack. "Excuse me," Nancy said, marching up to the group like she owned every square inch of the cul-de-sac. "This is a private HOA matter. Law enforcement isn't necessary." "That's not what the county thinks," Martha replied coolly, already unrolling the maps on the hood of her SUV. "Let's take a look, shall we?" Neighbors were gathering now, some sipping coffee, others filming with their phones. It wasn't every day the HOA's queen bee got publicly cross-examined on her own front lawn. Martha pointed to a yellowed section of the map. "Here. Parcel 17B. Owned by one Anderson Carter Trust, transferred in 1973. Michael stepped forward. "That's my grandfather." The trust retained mineral rights, utility easement rights, and, most importantly, explicit exemption from any future homeowner associations for 5 properties that remained in the family. Nancy laughed. But it was brittle. "Please. That can't possibly hold up. The HOA was established in 1995. We have binding covenants." "Not over pre-existing county agreements, you don't," Calvin said, tapping the map. "These easements run under your HOA roads. Technically, you're driving on Carter dirt." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Robert Taylor stepped up, waving a document. "Our bylaws clearly are irrelevant," Martha interrupted, pulling a dusty envelope from the box. "Filed with the county, signed by the Willow Creek Development Corporation, notarized, stamped, and legally binding." Nancy's face drained of color. But to her credit, or perhaps her arrogance, she doubled down. "I don't care what old paperwork you dug out of a basement," she snapped. "This vegetable monstrosity violates neighborhood standards, and I will see it removed." Sheriff Martinez cleared his throat, loudly. "Ma'am, if you instruct those bulldozers to move forward on land that isn't under HOA jurisdiction, while knowing that legal exemptions exist," he said, "you're not just facing a civil suit. You're looking at criminal trespass and property destruction." One of the dozer operators, previously bored, shut down his engine and climbed out of the cab. "I'm out," he muttered. "Ain't losing my license for few tomatoes." Michael stepped beside Martha, holding up the original land deed like a holy relic. "This land," he said, voice steady, "has been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather built this soil. My father protected it. I'm not letting you destroy it because you don't like the look of a zucchini." Nancy didn't speak, because for the first time since she'd declared war over a garden bed, she realized she was losing. The tension in the cul-de-sac was thick enough to bottle. The bulldozers sat dormant, like beasts muzzled by paperwork. Nancy stood rigid, her manicured fingers curled tight around her clipboard, while Robert Taylor flipped through legal pages with the panicked energy of a magician whose rabbit just disappeared. Then, from the back of the crowd, a familiar creak of metal caught everyone's attention. A frail voice cut through the morning air like a breeze through brittle leaves. "Well, I'll be damned. They finally pushed you too far, didn't they, Michael?" Eleanor Ramos, 83 years old and not an ounce of fear in her bones, hobbled forward with the help of a polished wooden cane. Her silver curls glowed in the sun, and she wore a navy cardigan with the same dignity she wore to her husband's funeral. The crowd parted for her like royalty. "Eleanor," Michael said, stepping forward. "You didn't have to come out." "Nonsense," she said, planting her cane in the driveway. I've lived here since the sidewalks were still gravel. I've seen bullies come and go, but I've never seen one this fancy. She turned, staring Nancy down. I remember when you used to come by selling magazine subscriptions for your little debate club. Guess some things never change. You're still trying to control what people read and plant. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Nancy's eyes narrowed to slits. Mrs. Ramos, this matter does not concern you. Oh, but it does, Eleanor replied, a smile playing at her lips. Especially since I know where those old deeds came from. Robert Taylor perked up. That land transfer document? It's outdated. The HOA's authority. Eleanor raised a single, arthritic finger. Was nullified before it began. I was there when Michael's grandfather negotiated with the developers. I made the coffee and typed the letters. He insisted that 5 lots remain forever under family jurisdiction. You two just didn't think anyone still alive remembered. Nancy turned pale. Robert flipped to a page in his binder, trying to suppress the tremble in his hands. Michael took a slow step toward Nancy, something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Familiarity. You remember Harvard Law, don't you, Nancy? He said, voice low measured. Class of '95. Professor Dellinger's ethics seminar. Nancy blinked. Just once. Then stiffened. You were top of the class, she spat. Big scholarship. Letters of recommendation. And me? Suspended for a rumor. One anonymous accusation of cheating and my career was stained for life. Michael nodded. It wasn't anonymous. The crowd collectively inhaled. I didn't want to say anything back then, Michael continued, his voice calm. But I saw you slip that answer sheet under your sleeve during the midterm. You were better than that, Nancy. You just didn't believe it. Nancy's eyes shimmered, not with tears, but rage. You think this is about vegetables? She hissed. It's always been about you. Your name on the dean's list. Your face in the alumni magazine. You with your perfect record and your damn tomatoes. Robert looked at her like she'd just confessed to arson on live television. Michael held up a worn envelope from the county's archives. This deed, he said. It was signed by my grandfather, notarized by Eleanor's late husband, and sealed with the original development agreement. It doesn't care about your vendetta. And it sure as hell doesn't care about your petty HOA rules. Nancy's voice trembled. You think you've won something? Eleanor laughed softly. Dear, all he wanted was to grow tomatoes. You're the one who brought the bulldozers. And in that moment, surrounded by neighbors, bulldozers, and a truth decades in the making, Nancy Williams realized she wasn't just facing a man with a garden. She was facing a legacy. And legacies don't scare easily. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows over Willow Creek estates, but the fire burning in Michael Carter's chest hadn't dimmed one bit. He was sitting at Eleanor Ramos's kitchen table, a chipped ceramic mug of chamomile tea cooling between his hands. Across from him, Eleanor opened a manila folder thick enough to choke a paper shredder. You ready for this? She asked, her voice soft, but her eyes sharp. More than I've ever been, Michael replied. Eleanor slid the folder toward him. Inside was a gold mine, or maybe a minefield. Bank statements, budget reports, photocopies of HOA newsletters, and a spreadsheet that looked like it had been typed on a typewriter. My Frank, she began, fingers grazing the pages, was an accountant for 42 years. He never trusted the HOA after they fined us for planting daisies in the side yard. Said something didn't add up. So, before he passed, he started requesting public financials. Quietly. Just out of curiosity. Michael flipped through the documents, brow furrowing deeper with each page. HOA fees, special assessments, and line items that made no sense, especially the ones labeled Pool Renovation Fund. Wait, Michael muttered. They've been collecting an extra $300 a month from every homeowner for 3 years? Yep, Eleanor said. Supposedly for a new Olympic-sized pool. Funny thing, though. The pool still looks like it did in 1998, missing tiles, rusty ladder, and all. Michael leaned forward, tapping a transfer entry on a bank statement. WC Holdings, LLC, $312,500 paid out in the last 24 months. That's not a contractor. That's a shell. Eleanor nodded solemnly. Guess who's listed as managing members? Michael didn't need to guess. He flipped to the LLC registration form Eleanor had smartly tucked in the back of the folder. Nancy Williams and Robert Taylor. His heart pounded. Not from shock, but from rage. They stole from the neighborhood, he whispered. They made the HOA their personal aid. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she reached for a photo at the bottom of the stack. She handed it to Michael with care. It was grainy, black and white, clearly from a home printer, but the face in it was unmistakable, an older man, thin and tired, standing beside a for sale sign. Harold Gilman, Eleanor said. Lived on Juniper Lane. Original homeowner. The HOA hit him with fine after fine. Said his porch swing was structurally inconsistent with the design code. Then they said his chimney needed to be repointed. Then his driveway was too narrow. Eventually, they threatened to put a lien on the house. Michael stared at the photo. He sold it for half its value, Eleanor whispered. Told me over coffee that he didn't want to fight anymore. Said Nancy promised she'd make the problems disappear if he signed quickly. And then, Michael asked, not sure he wanted the answer. He vanished. Moved out overnight. No forwarding address. No goodbye. I tried calling his number a dozen times. Disconnected. The silence that followed felt heavier than any lawsuit. Michael closed the folder, setting his palms flat on the wood table like he was grounding himself. This isn't just corruption, he said. This is predatory. It's calculated. They're bleeding the elderly dry, targeting the ones who can't fight back. Eleanor nodded, her expression grim. And Harold wasn't the only one. I've got 3 more cases just like his. They thought no one would notice. They thought we were too old, too tired, too polite. Michael stood up, folder in hand, his jaw set. They were wrong. Because now, the lawyer with dirt under his fingernails had something stronger than tomatoes. He had proof. And he had purpose. The next evening, Michael's living room looked more like a covert ops headquarters than a retired lawyer's home. The coffee table was buried under yellowed deeds, county maps, and a web of highlighter-marked financial records. In the middle of it all sat Michael, Eleanor, and most unexpectedly, Rachel. Gone was the HOA clipboard and polite nod. Tonight, Rachel wore jeans, a hoodie, and an expression that landed somewhere between grief and fury. I didn't know how to tell you before, she said, voice quiet but steady. My name is Rachel Gilman. Harold Gilman was my grandfather. Michael froze, the name hitting him like a fist to the ribs. Eleanor told me, Rachel continued. He disappeared after selling his house under pressure from the HOA. But what nobody knows is he didn't just leave. He had a heart attack 2 days after closing. Alone. In a rented trailer, 3 counties over. Eleanor covered her mouth, blinking away tears. My parents never got over it, Rachel said. But I wanted answers. So I applied to intern for the HOA straight out of community college, then worked my way into the admin team. They thought I was just some eager assistant. They never looked twice. And now, Michael said, his voice low, you're about to expose the very system that killed your grandfather. Rachel nodded. I wasn't planning to find allies. But then I saw you, standing up to Nancy. And I thought, maybe it's time. They pored over the maps again. Michael ran his finger across a faded boundary line marked in blue ink. These 5 parcels here, he said, were carved out from the HOA jurisdiction by deed back in 1973. But look, there are 7 more that trace back to the same original sale. Same family, same exemptions. Rachel jumped up and grabbed her laptop. Give me 5 minutes, she said, tapping furiously. I've been tracking HOA fines by address. If I'm right, she turned the screen toward them. 12 houses. Over $145,000 in bogus fines over the last decade. Holy hell, Michael muttered. Every single one of them is listed as a legacy exemption in the county archives, Rachel said. But HOA databases conveniently don't include those files. Eleanor leaned back in her chair. They've been bleeding us dry for years, betting we'd never fight back. Not anymore. Michael opened his phone and launched a live stream. "Neighbors of Willow Creek," he said into the camera, "it's time you saw what the HOA didn't want you to know." They went page by page, explaining how Nancy and Robert had ignored legal exemptions and targeted original homeowners, many of whom were elderly, isolated, or too afraid to challenge the board. Eleanor added historical context with her classic sass. "You think those fines for mailbox paint or Christmas lights were legit? Think again." Within minutes, the live stream exploded. Comments poured in. Shock. Anger. Familiar names flooded the chat. "That happened to us. My grandma got fined for her rocking chair. They made me rip up my rose bushes." Michael's phone buzzed so much it nearly vibrated off the table. By the time they ended the stream, nearly 100 neighbors had tuned in. Some were banging on Michael's door. Others were marching down the street, HOA letters in hand. Nancy's HOA reign had stood for nearly a decade. But that night, as rage boiled and truth spread like wildfire, it began to crumble. Because the originals were waking up. And they weren't going to be silent anymore. By Saturday night, Willow Creek's clubhouse, usually reserved for yoga classes and awkward potlucks, was packed wall-to-wall with angry neighbors, crossed arms, and the buzzing tension of a community ready to explode. Michael Carter stood at the front of the room, sleeves rolled up, tie askew, laptop connected to the big screen. And beside him, Rachel Gilman, Eleanor Ramos, and a stack of evidence thick enough to send chills down any prosecutor's spine. A banner still hung above the stage, Summer HOA Mixer, but the mood in the room was anything but festive. Michael cleared his throat. "Thanks for coming, everyone. I know this wasn't on the calendar, but when $100,000 disappears from a neighborhood fund, I think we make time." A few people chuckled, but most nodded grimly. He tapped the laptop, and the screen lit up with financial statements, scanned deeds, and that infamous list of 12 originals who'd been illegally fined for years. "I've spent the last week working with Eleanor and Rachel." Yes, that Rachel. All heads turned. Rachel gave a tight, brave smile. "To track every fraudulent fine, every shady transfer, every whisper of what our HOA has done under the table." The crowd murmured. Some faces darkened. Others glanced toward the back of the room, where Nancy Williams and Robert Taylor sat stiffly in the shadows, looking like guests of honor at their own funeral. Rachel stepped forward, voice steady. "WC Holdings LLC, owned by Nancy and Robert, has siphoned over $300,000 from our dues under the guise of a pool renovation that never happened. And worse, they've targeted homeowners with exemptions, including my own grandfather, who died alone after being bullied out of this neighborhood." Gasps. Eleanor raised her cane and waved it toward the back. "They fined me $200 for my holiday lights." Harold Gilman? They crushed him. And now they're coming for Michael's tomatoes. What's next? Charging us for how we mow our lawns. A few people yelled. They already did. The room buzzed with electricity. That's when Harold Fisher stood. At 70 years old, he was a former state judge with the kind of gravitas that made people listen. Bald, tall, and perpetually unimpressed, he cleared his throat. "I've lived here for 24 years, he began. "I've watched this HOA go from helpful to hostile, from a neighborhood group to a petty dictatorship." He looked directly at Nancy and Robert. "I move that we hold an immediate vote to dissolve the current HOA board, effective tonight. And in its place, we establish a temporary neighborhood council to review the bylaws and ensure financial transparency moving forward." The room erupted in applause. Nancy stood, red-faced. "You can't just..." "We can," Michael said calmly. "And we will." Rachel held up a clipboard. "We need 75% of homeowner signatures. We already have 63. "Make that 64, someone shouted. 65, another yelled. Within 10 minutes, every adult in the room had lined up to sign. All 76 eligible voters put their names on that clipboard. And just like that, Nancy's empire fell. She didn't say a word as she grabbed her purse and stormed out, Robert trailing behind her like a defeated intern. No eye contact. No goodbye. Just the sound of their heels echoing across the polished tile floor. But Michael knew it wasn't over. Not yet. Because people like Nancy didn't slink away. They plotted in silence. And he could feel it in his gut. This wasn't her last move. Not by a long shot. The night after the revolt, Michael Carter sat on his porch in the quiet darkness, a blanket draped over his shoulders and a cup of cooling coffee resting on the railing. For the first time in days, Willow Creek Estates was calm. Too calm. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. He was just about to head inside when his phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number. Check your security cam. Now. His blood ran cold. Michael dashed inside, heart pounding, fingers fumbling as he pulled up the security feed on his tablet. The live feed was clear, nothing but night shadows, a few garden gnomes, and the soft hum of distant crickets. Then he rewound to 2:46 a.m., and the nightmare unfolded. Two figures dressed in black slipped into frame, moving like predators. One tall, broad-shouldered, the other shorter, more deliberate. Masks covered their faces, but Michael didn't need a DNA test to know who they were. Nancy Williams and Robert Taylor. Even under cover of darkness, Nancy moved with that same determined strut, like she was the queen of a kingdom, even as she defiled its soil. She walked straight to the garden. His garden. The one he'd built with his hands and guarded with his soul. Tomatoes, squash, basil, ripped from the ground like weeds. Robert followed, smashing ceramic planters with a metal rod. The sound of shattering clay echoed through the speakers like bones snapping. Then came the paint. Nancy pulled a red spray can from her bag and began scrawling across the side of Michael's white picket fence. Our originals burn so easily. Michael felt bile rise in his throat. His hands trembled, but he forced himself to keep watching. He needed this recorded. He needed evidence. On screen, Nancy stepped back to admire her work like it was art, not a hate crime. Then she turned, looked directly into the camera, straight into Michael's soul. She pulled down her mask, smirked, and slowly dragged her finger across her throat in a menacing, deliberate gesture. Michael dropped the tablet like it was on fire. His heart hammered against his ribs. He rushed to his landline and called Sheriff Martinez. I have footage, he said. You need to see this. Now. Within 20 minutes, patrol cars lined his driveway, lights flashing silently in the dark like ominous Christmas decorations. Deputies fanned out, documenting the destruction. Eleanor arrived in her robe and slippers, clutching a thermos of black coffee and a fire in her eyes. Oh, dear Lord, she whispered, seeing the damage. She's completely lost it. Michael showed the sheriff the footage. Martinez's jaw tightened with every passing second. She's escalating, he muttered. This goes beyond vandalism. That throat-cutting gesture? That's a threat. And with this spray-painted message, this could be prosecuted as intimidation, even domestic terrorism, depending on context. Michael nodded. He didn't say it aloud, but he felt it deep in his bones. This wasn't just about the garden anymore. Nancy wasn't trying to win a battle. She was declaring war. And if history had taught him anything, it's that desperate people make dangerous choices. As Martinez filed the report and the deputies cleared the scene, Michael stood alone in the wreckage of his peaceful retirement. The garden was gone, but his resolve had never been stronger. He wasn't afraid of Nancy. He was done playing defense. It was time to dig deeper. And maybe, just maybe, burn her empire to the ground, using nothing but the truth. By sunrise, Nancy Williams and Robert Taylor were no longer fugitives in the shadows. They were fugitives in handcuffs. Sheriff Martinez didn't wait. At 6:13 a.m. sharp, he led a team of deputies to Nancy's colonial-style home, the one with the hyper-manicured lawn and the obnoxiously symmetrical hydrangeas, and knocked with the patience of a man already tired of excuses. When Nancy opened the door, still in silk pajamas, mascara smeared from a night of no sleep and maybe too much wine, she barely had time to form a sentence before the cuffs clicked shut. Across town, Robert was arrested leaving his gated condo. He had tried to play cool, murmuring something about just a misunderstanding, but the deputies found HOA laptops, burner phones, and most damning, a flash drive labeled WC Holdings Payouts. By mid-morning, the news broke like a dropped wine glass. 5 local stations had parked news vans on Michael Carter's front lawn before he'd even had time to trim the rose bushes. The cul-de-sac buzzed with reporters, cameras, and neighbors holding coffee mugs like popcorn. Michael stood on his porch, not in a suit, not with a podium, but in his jeans and garden boots, worn but grounded. "Mr. Carter, is it true the HOA embezzled over $300,000? "Yes," he answered calmly. "But the bigger crime was what they tried to do to this community: silence, intimidate, and isolate the very people who built it." The reporters ate it up. Cameras zoomed in. Microphones stretched forward like eager dogs on leashes. And then Rachel stepped forward. She wasn't hiding anymore. "My name is Rachel Gilman," she said, voice loud and clear. "You might know me as the HOA secretary. What you don't know is that I'm also the granddaughter of Harold Gilman, one of the original homeowners this HOA bullied into selling his house." Gasps rippled through the crowd. They pushed him out with fake fines, threats of foreclosure. 2 days later, he died of a heart attack in a trailer park. Alone. Forgotten. That's why I joined the HOA, to find the truth. And now you all know it. The camera lights flared. One reporter wiped tears. Another mouthed, "Oh my God." Michael placed a hand on her shoulder. "You didn't just find the truth, Rachel. You helped expose a system that needed to fall." That afternoon, Sheriff Martinez called a second press conference. This time, inside the courthouse. He revealed the findings from Robert's flash drive and the financials recovered from HOA emails, forged documents, fake votes, personal payouts disguised as consulting fees, and a coordinated plan to target elderly residents, fine them into submission, and buy their homes under market value through shell companies. But the real bombshell? 2 more HOA board members were in on it. One handled the bookkeeping. The other managed internal communications, flagging which residents seemed weak, alone, or financially vulnerable. They'd created a spreadsheet called Priority Exits. That was the moment the crowd in the courthouse audibly gasped. "What kind of monsters target retirees with fixed incomes?" someone muttered. Nancy and Robert now faced charges including fraud, criminal conspiracy, elder abuse, and destruction of property. Bail was denied. The judge called them a threat to their own neighbors. By evening, Michael's face was all over the news. He was dubbed the Tomato Lawyer on Twitter, and memes were already spreading. One of Nancy in handcuffs with the caption, "HOA, Harvest of Arrests." But for Michael, it wasn't about headlines. It was about Harold, Eleanor, Rachel, the originals, and the garden that started it all. Because sometimes, the only thing standing between a corrupt system and the truth is a man who refuses to be uprooted. Spring came early to Willow Creek Estates. The frost melted faster than usual that year, as if even the weather was eager to put the cold season of fear and fines behind it. Where there had once been whispers of HOA meetings and threats about mailbox sizes, there were now the sounds of laughter, trowels digging in dirt, and neighbors, real neighbors, working side by side. The HOA was gone. Officially dissolved, unanimously voted out, its bylaws shredded and burned in a symbolic bonfire behind the clubhouse. In its place, the community had formed a new group, Friendly Neighbors of Willow Creek, led not by rules but by respect. No fines. No Bulldozers. Just folks looking out for each other the way neighborhoods used to. The best part? They turned Nancy Williams's old front lawn, once a sterile showcase of ornamental shrubs and rigid flower symmetry, into the community's first shared vegetable garden. There was something poetic about it. Where she once stood in designer heels barking orders, now stood rows of sweet corn, cherry tomatoes, peppers, and sprigs of fresh basil. The same soil she tried to control had become a symbol of everything she failed to understand: growth, generosity, and grassroots power. Michael Carter stood at the edge of that reclaimed lawn, his jeans muddy, his hands calloused, but his spirit lighter than it had felt in years. He watched as kids planted sunflower seeds, teenagers laid stepping stones, and retirees knelt side by side, trading gardening tips like precious family recipes. A familiar creak came from behind. He turned just in time to see Eleanor Ramos, dressed in her Sunday hat and gardening gloves, shuffling toward him with a paper bag clutched to her chest. "Thought you should have this," she said, her smile as warm as the sun overhead. Inside the bag, nestled in a bed of newspaper, was the first tomato of the season. Plump, bright red. Perfect. Michael took it gently, like receiving a medal. "It's beautiful." "So is this," she said, gesturing around them. "Look what you started." He glanced at the scene. Neighbors who'd barely spoken for years now swapping zucchini for zucchini bread, kids helping seniors carry tools, Rachel laughing with a group of teenagers by the compost bin. It wasn't just a garden. It was a restoration. And speaking of Rachel, she stepped out from behind the trellis, brushing dirt off her jeans, her ponytail loose, her smile crooked in that way that made Michael's heart do something inconvenient. "You planting today?" she asked. "Was thinking about it," he said. "Something new. Maybe some snap peas. Or maybe trust." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Trust, huh? That one's tricky to grow." "Yeah," he said, grinning. "But I hear it thrives in good soil." She laughed, and together, they knelt in the soil, rich, dark, and ready. He opened a small paper packet of seeds and poured a few into her palm. "This time," he said, "we don't just grow food. We grow something stronger." She looked at him. "A future?" He nodded. "A community." They pressed the seeds into the dirt. All around them, the garden buzzed with life. Birds chirping, bees bouncing from bloom to bloom, neighbors calling across rows of vegetables with inside jokes and shared stories. And for the first time in a long time, Michael Carter wasn't defending something. He was building it. With every seed, every laugh, every hand extended instead of pointing in judgment, Willow Creek was blooming again. And under the warm sun of a new season, so was he.